Well, good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this business breakfast dealing with some issues related to decommissioning. Thank you very much for turning out on a rather wild morning. It's great to see so many people here. Well, I'm going to start with the first presentation this morning, talking about this issue of long-term liability in the context of offshore decommissioning. And then after I've spoken, we'll have a brief session from Richard Neilson, Professor Richard Neilson, who's going to introduce the new National Decommissioning Centre of Excellence. So let's dive right in and see what if this is going to work. We turn it on. There we go. So let's just remind ourselves of the problem that we're talking about this morning. So we know that when we decommission, there is a possibility that in certain circumstances we can leave infrastructure partially or wholly in place. And under international law, we have instruments that are relatively permissive in that regard. So UNCLOS and the London Dumping Convention in its current form are actually relatively permissive in relation to that idea of leaving in place. But of course in this region, we're also subject to OSPAR 1992, and it of course is more restrictive. I'm pretty sure everyone here will be very familiar with the derogation cases. I'm paraphrasing here, but in essence, we're dealing with situations where it's going to be technically difficult, if not impossible, to leave structure, gravity bases, concrete gravity bases, footings of large steel structures, and exceptional circumstances. And just by way of example, if we look at Shell's current Brent decommissioning plan, and we've got examples of two of those there, the first two derogation cases. And then, of course, the question is, if we are actually going to leave infrastructure in place, where is liability going to lie for that infrastructure? So that's our basic problem we're dealing with. Now, if we go back through time, through the various iterations of the guidance notes, which is the way in which the relevant department through time in the UK has indicated how we will implement our international obligations. If we go back to the last version before the current version, this was pretty typical of what we were being told by government. So the persons who own an installation or pipeline at the time of its decommissioning will remain the owners of any residue, and any residual liability remains with the owners in perpetuity, in all time coming, forever. Now, any claims for compensation that goes on from third parties arising from damage caused by any remains will be a matter for the owners and the affected parties and will be covered by the general law. So a very, very clear statement. It's a question of who owned it at the point of decommissioning, and the government's not going to get involved in this. This is a matter for the general law between the parties affected. But that's pretty much the only statement that we had in this regard. There's no cases, if you like, to refer onto. If we look at the most recent guidance, it's actually developed a little bit. We've got some, I think, potentially significant changes. So we've got the persons or parties who own an installation or pipeline, pretty much as it was before, but now we have the addition of or are a Section 29 notice holder. Okay? At the time of its decom, will remain the owners of any residues. We've then got something relatively similar. Residual liability remains with the owners in perpetuity, but then clearly what we've got in the next phrase is a recognition on the part of the government that, of course, if we're leaving liability with companies in perpetuity, there is, of course, the possibility in the long term that that company will no longer exist in its current form or indeed at all. So we get this reference here, continued contact will therefore be required as part of the closeout report, and OPRED must be notified of any changes to the company structure and domicile. Now, that's quite a long-term commitment that is then being taken on from an administrative point of view to track who will be the holder of that liability in the long term. And then we get a kind of repetition of the previous point about where claims for compensation would lie. The only change in that wording is here, where instead of general law, we have the word applicable law. Okay, so if anything, the net has extended slightly in as much as we now have that reference to Section 29 notice holders as well. So, one way of looking at this is to say, should we actually be worrying too much? Because given that answer, if an owner would be liable for negligence where a duty of care exists, so the first thing that we need to identify is whether we're dealing with circumstances where such a duty of care would actually lie. And the basic proposition here is from the case of Caparo against Dickman back in 1990. For those of you who are more into tort law and delict, you will know there are some subsequent cases, but I'm reassured by my colleagues who are much more au fait with the development of the law in this case that for all practical purposes this remains a reasonable way of looking at things. So we get a threefold test for the existence of a duty of care. This is Lord Bridge of Harwich back in 1990. First test, is there sufficient proximity between the parties? Secondly, was the loss foreseeable? And finally, is it fair, just and reasonable in all the circumstances to impose the duty of care? So this is the test we need to pass. So when we look at that, let's take a scenario. So heaven forbid a vessel comes in contact with some remains and we have a loss. Is the threefold test passed? Well, I think in all probability it is. Because if we go back to that previous slide, is there sufficient proximity between the parties? I think there is, because we're talking about the owners of that infrastructure leaving it in place. It's entirely reasonable to see them as having a duty of care to other users of the maritime area, all else equal. Is it foreseeable that a loss would occur? I think it is. If there were to be any contact between infrastructure remaining in place and a vessel, we can certainly foresee that loss occurring. Is it fair, just, and reasonable in the circumstances? Well, in the absence of anyone else who would take liability, and it's been made very clear to us by the government that liability and perpetuity remains with the owner, then I think a fairly strong case could be made. However, it's then a question of how do we actually discharge our duty of care? If we take it for granted that we are the owners of that infrastructure and that duty of care lies, we then need to think about what do we do to discharge the duty. Have we fulfilled all our obligations under the Petroleum Act? We can tick all the boxes. Yes, we've done that. Have we informed the Hydrographic Office? Are all these remains marked on the charts? Fine, okay. What about our closeout report being accepted by the regulator? If we've ticked that box, again, that is going well down the road to discharging the duty. What about complying with any schedule for post-decommissioning monitoring? Again, if we can demonstrate that. Basically, I think we'd be in a pretty strong position, now obviously I'm going through this very quickly, we'd be in a strong position to argue that we have discharged our duty of care. So even if there were to be a loss, we'd be able to say, well, we have done everything that we reasonably could to discharge that duty. So, taking all that in the round, could we actually say that this is not really that much of a problem? And that's certainly one way of looking at it. On the other hand, what happens if someone does suffer loss? Are they to be left without a remedy? Are we clear that we are aware of what all potential future harms might be in relation to infrastructure remaining in place? What if a duty holder no longer exists when a claim arises? So in other words, there has been no one actually to, as it were, fulfill that ongoing duty of care. So we're in a situation where we may have a situation where we as an industry might be able to reassure ourselves that we do everything that we possibly can, but we could nevertheless end up in a situation where there are parties who are aggrieved and we seem to be lacking a remedy. Now, what's interesting here is, again, one of the modifications to the most recent version of departmental guidance says, OPRED encourages industry to work collaboratively to develop a mutual management plan or instrument to manage the ongoing monitoring and legacy of the infrastructure remaining in situ. Now, we already have arrangements in relation to the fishing industry. We seem to be getting a steer here from OPRED that they would like to see something analogous, perhaps, in relation to broader issues of liability. An interesting point. But looking at the way in which the law operates offshore, when one tries to put all the different bits of the jigsaw together, it's not always easy to make the case that those pieces do in fact fit together to make a coherent picture. So one way of looking at this from a different perspective is to say, well, let's take this whole question of ownership seriously. Let's dig down into that and try and get a sense of whether we're satisfied with that bold proposition that we get in departmental guidance. So we know that that proposition is that residual liability lies with the owner. It specifies who the owner is and now extends the net to Section 29 notice holders. What about property law? Well, bear with me now, the lawyers in the audience already might be thinking, hang on a minute, he's off on a total frolic here, but just bear with me and see what we think. If we had infrastructure built on land, on shore, then if that infrastructure remains in place, property law would say, and this is pretty much the case wherever you look in the world, in fact, property law would say that that infrastructure belongs to the owner of the land. It's a fixture. Okay. What if we have infrastructure remaining in place on the seabed, on the continental shelf, beyond the territorial sea, under a derogation case? Does that belong to the owner of the seabed? Because it's a fixture, almost by definition, because it's a derogation case, we know we pretty much can't take that thing out. Does that make it a fixture, and therefore actually in the ownership of whoever has ownership of the seabed? Well, that's an interesting question. Now, lawyers might already be saying, well, hang on a minute, property law in that sense doesn't actually apply offshore. We could make the case that it applies out to 12 nautical miles, the territorial sea, because in the UN Convention, we have a clear distinction being drawn between sovereignty in the territorial sea and what lies beneath it, and sovereign rights in what lies beyond that, in the continental shelf and the exclusive economic zone. So we could make the argument that in fact there's a conceptual distinction in the rights that the coastal state enjoys in those two zones, and that the difference in those concepts is such that we can't really talk of property in the same way on the continental shelf. But there's other ways of kind of breaking that down, and again it's all about looking at all the different bits of the jigsaw and trying to make sense of them. So we all know if you want to do hydrocarbons out there, get a license. But if you want to do renewables or carbon sequestration, get a license and get a lease. Okay? Get a lease from the Crown Estate. The question then is, inasmuch as this further conceptual distinction has now been drawn between a license and a lease, does that mean that someone, whoever is issuing the lease, is essentially exercising property rights and claiming strong property rights in the continental shelf? Because then my question would be, if you're claiming property rights and you're deriving a benefit from them, given that there's something that distinguishes the continental shelf here where we might have a wind farm and here where we might have some hydrocarbons. So if you're taking the benefits over here, on what grounds do you avoid any liabilities over here? Okay, so let's move on from that. Even if we're not convinced by that, and the whole thing is, I'm simply a humble professor of law, so I don't know what the answer is to that last question. We don't really have any definitive statements. But even if we regard that whole property argument as a bit of a dead end, a bit of a red herring, are there policy reasons for suggesting that we actually want the state to assume liability? Under that previous alternative view, it looks like some emanation of the state may indeed have liability because they simply own the stuff. Okay, what about here from a policy point of view? Well, given that we have this under the current statement from the department, we have essentially this long-term ongoing contingent liability in the hands of oil companies. And given that we know that 50 years from now certain companies may not exist in their current form or may have exited this jurisdiction, it would certainly remove uncertainties both for users of the maritime space, but also for investors in the late stage of the province. Equally, it would avoid inequitable outcomes, because you could have a loss occurring in one place where it so happens that an identifiable duty holder still exists, but one occurring elsewhere where there's no identifiable duty holder. We would end up with unequal situations for the claimants in both cases. But if we're actually going from a policy point of view, say to the state, tell you what, why don't you take on the liability? What's in it for them apart from liability? Well, there's an example for this. Many of us will know that in Norway, under the Petroleum Activities Act, there is the possibility that in the event of decisions for abandonment, it may be agreed between the licensees and the owners on one side and the state on the other side that future maintenance, responsibility and liability shall be taken over by the state based on an agreed financial compensation. So perhaps we could do something where that mutual arrangement actually involves the state. So the industry, on the basis of payment, transfers liability to the state. And also from the state's point of view, given that we're trying to encourage ongoing investment in this very late part of the basin, that could be a positive signal that the state sends. You've got plenty to worry about already, let's take one worry off your plate. And equally, from that policy point of view, we could actually say we've got precedent for that. So under the Carbon Capture and Storage Directive, that whole model operates on the basis that after carbon is injected into an aquifer or a depleted reservoir, after a certain period, the state will assume liability. Once it is satisfied that the CO2 is behaving as anticipated, liability actually transfers to the state. And that, of course, could also have implications for another part of decommissioning, ongoing liability for plugged and abandoned wells. If the state is willing to assume liability for sequestered carbon, how do we distinguish that from liability for hydrocarbons in plugged wells? Finally, there's maybe another way of looking at this, and that is from an environmental protection point of view. So, over the last few years, certainly when I attend meetings and conferences and workshops related to decommissioning, I would say over the last few years there's been a growing willingness on the part of industry, but also principally driven by environmental scientists themselves, to speak in terms of rethinking OSPAR 1983. So a lot of people think, well, it's rather restrictive. It sets out fairly narrowly defined derogation cases, and it actually leaves out of account certain possible options for which there might nevertheless be strong scientific evidence. So if you take all the existing documentation together, especially 1983 and the guidelines on artificial reefs, it's pretty clear that at the moment in this part of the world we can't leave an installation in place on the basis that, for example, it's part of the ecosystem, it's basically for all practical purposes an artificial reef already. That doesn't seem to be an option. We can argue that there are perhaps some incoherences in OSPAR's approach there, a preference for reuse and recycling, except in the context of using a platform as a reef. Equally, we have the fact that you could have marine growth on a platform, but that's not a relevant consideration. You can even have protected species on the platform, habitats directed species, but that won't be a relevant consideration under OSPAR. So if we did get as far as taking the environmental argument seriously and thinking, well, if we're going to be evidence-based and science-based and come up with a coherent way of thinking about decommissioning, we could end up with more infrastructure being left in place. That, of course, would then further extend the question of ongoing liability. But in as much as we would then be talking about leaving infrastructure in place for environmental reasons, there would seem to be a strong argument for that those being protected places under one of the various ways in which sites of special scientific interest, Natura 2000 sites, whatever it might be, are essentially in the hands of the state. So again, from an environment point of view, we could end up in that same proposition. So, basically, if we try and draw some conclusions, certainly as I talk to people in the industry over the last few years, this question of continuing liability is one that does exercise minds. The idea that this goes on forever and we don't really have a way necessarily of easily quantifying it is one that causes some concern. Given that the longevity of remains is something an order of magnitude different perhaps to the potential transience of commercial actors, we've got a bit of a mismatch there, and that's a worry to other people using the maritime space. We've looked at some different options this morning, but even if the property law one is a red herring, although I'm still interested to know how all those different bits of the jigsaw fit together, but even if it is a red herring, well, perhaps there are good policy reasons for thinking about liability in the hands of the state. Perhaps there are also reasons linked to proper scientifically based environmental protection decisions leading to liability remaining in the hands of the state. So, I'm afraid I don't have any definitive answers. What I'm trying to do, and what we're trying to do generally in our research here, both within the university and also collaboratively with others, both domestically and internationally, is to try and dig into some of these questions, try and open up the conversation, not take for granted the way things currently are, if there are better ways of doing it. So that's very much the spirit in which I'm putting forward these ideas this morning. So what I'm going to do is, I think Richard's going to speak next, and then we'll hold over Q&A until after the second presentation, if that's okay with you. That okay? So I'll hand over without further ado.
So my name is Richard Neilson. I'm Professor in School of Engineering at the University of Aberdeen. I'm also at the moment the University's Interim Director of the National Decommissioning Centre, which has been set up between the OGTC and the University. So I just want to give a kind of overview of what we're doing with the OGTC, but also I'll tie it a little bit back into the liability issues that John was talking about. So the National Decommissioning Centre is a partnership between the University of Aberdeen and OGTC. So both parties are putting funding into this. It's part of Aberdeen City deal. So the Aberdeen City deal brought substantial funding into the Aberdeen area, Aberdeenshire area for infrastructure, but part of that was funds to set up the Oil and Gas Technology Centre. And part of the bid also included that the OGTC would set up a number of centres of excellence. At the moment there are two of these. One is decommissioning, one is a subsea. Decommissioning one sits with Aberdeen, and the subsea one will sit with RGU. And I keep getting asked why did Aberdeen pitch for a decommissioning centre of excellence? And what I would say is that the part of that was that there is research going on here. So I mean, John's just discussed some of the legal issues. But if you look across the board, we've got our biological scientists have done quite a lot of work with operators looking at monitoring pre-decommissioning and things like cuttings piles and so on. Within engineering, we've looked at underwater lifting and cutting and various other processes. And within economics, I mean, most people know of Professor Alex Kemp and the work he does in terms of the kind of fiscal side of decommissioning and the projections in terms of cost and the effects of taxation. So one of the reasons we actually decided with the OGT to go for this was that we actually have a spread of skills across the university which cover decommissioning. So it wasn't just an engineering topic, but it's a much more multidisciplinary thing. We could draw in skills from other schools. So at the moment we have about £13 million promised from OGTC, 5 million coming in from the university, and we just secured 1.9 million earlier this year from the Scottish Government as well. So the aim of this is to be the global leader in research and development that transforms oil and gas decommissioning and mature field management. So be aware that we're not just looking at the decommissioning side, we're also looking at the late life side of things as well. So the objectives, there are multiple objectives in this. Obviously one of the key ones, which is set up in the OGA, is to maximise economic recovery. So to look at this late life piece and how we can extend life as well as look at decommissioning. Reducing costs, there's obviously a target of cost reduction of 35% set by the OGA relative to the 2016 benchmark costs. We're very keen to develop the supply chain, and obviously what's one of OGTC's prime functions is to look at technology and grow the supply chain in this region. And then there are things which are more particular to universities. So for both universities, actually for RGU and ourselves in terms of working with OGTC, is to enhance our research performance. So we already do research, but this is to try and build this up, larger capacity, larger capability, more skills, higher quality. And research income as well. So we have a regular research assessment, and that comes up in about 2 years' time. And one of the metrics which universities are scored by is the research income. So one of the aims as well as to increase performance is to increase income. One of those metrics that we're judged by. So the focus areas, 3 main areas, which are current challenges for decommissioning, future challenges, and then thought leadership. And some of the thought leadership fits into the kind of the work that John was describing earlier on. So in terms of current challenges, things like facilities cleanup and disposal, well, P&A, a huge one. skills and capability development. And in terms of the skills side of things, obviously the university already has started this because 2 years back we kicked off, sorry, 1 year back, we kicked off the MSc in decommissioning. And so we're going to graduate to over 20 students, I think on Friday actually, from that course. We have more students coming in this year, and we've got about 50 or 60 online students as well. So students who are in industry or other, have other commitments who are studying online. And we're just getting accreditation for a short CPD course, a two-day CPD course in decommissioning. The future challenges, design for reuse, next generation decommissioning, design for decommissioning, these are the areas we're looking at. And then the thought leadership bit comes back to what we can do across the basin, which might include the whole question of liability. It will include the question of environmental studies, which might then feed back into the question about OSPAR. So about 2 months ago, I think Roger Essen, who was head of the Solution Centre for Decommissioning at that point, ourselves got together and we had a day with industry looking at what the current challenges are. So this is the kind of work programme that came out of that. So 3 main areas. So this is kind of under the current challenges: mature basin management, well decommissioning, and late life decommissioning. And again, you can see these are multidisciplinary. We've got things like business models in here. So although we're working with the Oil and Gas Technology Centre, these are policy issues, regulatory issues, contractual issues, and business issues. So some of the big ones here actually are business models and long-term liability, comparative assessment, how we make decision making for the best outcome for decommissioning in terms of the 5 main criteria, which include the environment. And one area also that we're really interested in looking at is basin-wide simulation. So trying to effectively make a digital model of the basin in terms of what needs to be decommissioned and how best we go around that. Well decommissioning, things like barrier verification, the current landscape in terms of abandonment, and alternative barrier methods. So we just recently put in a bid to the Scottish Government for just under £400,000 for a study to look at setting up a barrier qualification system at the new centre. And we had word yesterday that looks like that's going to go ahead, so we'll be looking to design something and then build something where we can take some of the new technologies like thermite and bismuth, which are potential game changers in terms of well deploying abandonment, and test those out on surface before some are deployed. And then we've got the late life decommissioning. So again, this optimal decommissioning, capability alternative methods for removal, and OGTC has some projects ongoing in that. And again, the environmental science side of things down here. What we would say is we're not looking to work in isolation, so this is not just Aberdeen, full stop. We're aware that we have capability here, and we've got some great people, some great skills, great facilities, but actually there is a wealth of experience and a wealth of skills and facilities across the country. So the plan is that Aberdeen will become the hub, and we will then work with a number of spokes. Now those may be other universities, and we're already in discussions with some of them. They may be research institutes, and they may be decommissioning yards. But the idea is then to set these up, and we will work with those and coordinate the research across that. And the planned services for the centre will be joint research projects, PhD studentships, and testing and trials. And I'll come down to so the top ones who are kind of in place at the moment. We'll be running joint projects. Ideally, we'd like to have things where multiple operators, multiple companies come in and agree a topic, and we will then run those for that cluster, making outcomes as publicly open as possible. Obviously, there'll be cases where we can't do that, and there's some commerciality. We're just setting up dedicated PhD students. We're setting up a centre for doctoral training in decommissioning. That's underway at the moment. We've had a call for projects. We've selected 5 of those. Immediately after this meeting, we're going on to have a sound bit to look at, identify 2 or 3 more, and those will be advertised soon. So we hope to have sort of between 5 and 10 students a year, PhD students, going through that, and they can draw on things like the MSc programme for some of their skills. I think testing and trials, and we will be setting up a number of facilities within the centre where we can do testing. But beyond that, OGC also have very good links into the operators, so there will be opportunities for things like well PA trials with operators who are willing to give facilities. We're also looking at rapid prototypes, so we've got a couple of new CNC machines coming in, but we're looking at what we do longer term in terms of some of the newer metal forming processes. We've got access to RGU's decom simulator, but we will also be looking at how we simulate across the basin in terms of decommissioning. And digital and data will be another big thing, so I'll come back to the facilities in a while, but actually having good data and having access to that at appropriate levels is going to become, I think, a major thing in terms of decommissioning. So this is one of the areas we will be looking at. So just in terms of this, so far this has been kind of the vision, but in terms of what we're actually physically going to do, some of you may recognise these buildings. These are two of the buildings we have out in Newborough. They were originally designed for deep water marine exploration, and therefore have some facilities already built into them which are relevant. So the left-hand building, the south building is primarily lab space, and the north building is primarily office space, but will also include some other facilities. So the top line here are the facilities we already have in place. We've got hyperbaric testing. We can test down to 6,500 metres, and this is because the original building was built for deep water exploration. We've got an immersion tank and environmental chambers which you can use for testing. We've also got vibration testing. We're just in the process of purchasing an industrial laser. This will be the part where we've got highest power laser that was being built into a university environment in the UK. So looking at 15 kilowatts, and that will be used for underwater cutting, but also maybe used for other processes as well, which are relevant to decommissioning. We're just in the process, we've just tendered for a new high power computing cluster. This will be larger than the university's existing cluster. The university's also put some matching funding to that, so we're going to end up with something which is about 2.5 times more powerful than the university's existing computing facilities. And some part of that will be dedicated to the centre. And I'd say we've got some advanced workshop facilities going into the building as well. So sorry, I keep jumping too far. So one of the facilities that's going in and was funded by the Scottish Government is almost a replication of the hub. So those of you who have been to the Oil and Gas Technology Centre's Queen's Road facility and have been downstairs may have used the hub facility for kind of breakout discussion. So we have an updated version of this. So we've taken some of the learnings from that environment and built them into a new space in the north building. So we have an area here for the innovation area where we've got 4 clusters. This is the actual setup here. So this is similar to the space in the OGTC's hub, which has the tables and screens. And the idea of this is we'll have a breakout where we can have six people and a facilitator working the screen, coming up with ideas, and then we feed back to the main camp area here, which is like Queen's Road large screen area. So we can draw all that information together, discussing groups first, and then discussing the large group afterwards. So that's virtually finished up at the facilities at Newborough. So in terms of who we want to work with, everybody basically. So very much in terms of operators, as John's been talking about, they will be people who have the long-term liability. So in terms of long-term stuff, particularly the operators, and it's operators as well who may well be able to look at the wider basin stuff. So very keen to work with them. Tier 1 contractors, there are obviously some technology things we'll be developing for Tier 1 and Tier 2. But also technology developers. So the bid we put into the Decommissioning Challenge Fund includes a technology developer who's interested in utilising the facilities when we get them built. Very keen to, we're working with the regulators. We have discussions in process already with the likes of OPRED and OGA. And we'll have continued discussions with them to see how the work we're doing feeds into the work they do. And other industries at the end here, and particularly the wind side of things, so the offshore renewable side. So we already have a project, we just had a funded project with Interreg, which is one of the European Union setups. And we have a project which will run for 4 years, about €250,000, part of a much larger project. looking at the decommissioning of wind farms. So a lot of people thinking offshore wind is just coming in, but actually one of the things to look at is to look ahead and see what's going to happen in terms of decommissioning. And that's quite a different challenge as well, because if you look at the North Sea, most of the platforms are one-offs or two-offs. There's if you look at Brentsfield, Bravo and Delta are quite similar, but not identical. But very few things are very similar. When it comes to wind farms, you might have 100 wind turbines, all the same, needing decommissioned. So it's quite different. It's almost like a mass production type project. But it's two things. One is that there'll be, I think, learnings from the oil and gas sector which go into the offshore renewables, but there may be some things which come back from that as well. So I guess some of these things have been tried in the past, but some of the unique approaches, this has government backing. I say we already had 1.9 million from the Scottish Government. Obviously the OGTC is funded by the Scottish Government and UK governments in terms of its funding. I say we just gone into the Scottish Government Decommissioning Challenge Fund, and that was very positive in terms of further support. Access to funding, the OGTC obviously comes with good funding in terms of looking for projects. We're working very much on an interdisciplinary approach, so a lot of this was kicked off by the fact that we have these groups in law, engineering, biological sciences, economics and geosciences. And actually our MSc programme was kicked off because of that. It was just John and myself and some others getting together and discussing and thinking we should do something about this. The advantage of being universities, we can bring scientific rigour to this. So if an oil operator went to OSPAR and said, I'd like to leave this in place because I think environmentally it's going to be good, I think that would be a very short conversation. But we have the opportunity, I think, alongside the new second phase of Insight, which Richard Hare is setting up, I think we've got an opportunity here to look at scientific rigour, particularly around the environmental piece, and see what is best for the environment, not just that the legislation says take it out. It might be that actually leaving it in place is actually better for the fishermen. There may be some risks, so it's in this case of balancing risk. So with the opportunity of looking scientifically at some of these bigger problems. And we've also got the chance to look across the UKCS. So we're looking very much at challenge-based, so I mentioned earlier on we've got current challenges, future challenges, and then obviously the thought leadership side of things. The OGTC brings access to offshore facilities through its membership, which is great, the opportunity to do things like field trials. We've got this collaborative partnership model, so it isn't just going to be Aberdeen, it's going to be Aberdeen plus bespokes, whether those are universities or other research institutes. But the advantage of having Aberdeen as the hub will be that we've got single stop shop, that you come into here, and if we can't do it, we'll show you who can and work out how we deal with that. So that's where our hub and spoke model comes in. I should say as well, the collaborative model is also a partnership between ourselves and industry. It's not just ourselves and OGTC. So the kind of proposition, I'm not doing total sales pitch here, I'm not going to get to the point where I'm asking you to sign checks. But the kind of proposition we've got is strategic input. So we're looking at how we shape the R&D programs for the industry. Tailored research, so some of the projects we'll be running will be global or UK basin-wide, but some may be particular for particular companies, so particularly Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 contractors who may want a competitive edge in particular things. But some of it will be the wider work which benefits the UKCS. All being well, whoever comes in will have access to the brightest and best PhD and MScs. And we already do work in terms of the MSCs. We've already done work with bringing company projects into that. So we did 2 or 3 this year with OGTC and with other companies as well. So we've got dedicated workspace. So this is not just a virtual centre. This is a centre where we've got physical space. We've got a large lab space actually out at Newborough, and capacity of about 50 people in the office building. And particularly this collaboration space. So we've got this opportunity not just to do work, but actually get together, collaborate, and link into other centres as well. One of the things we will be picking up from the skills in OGTC is facilitation, because actually part of the reason the collaboration space works is that if you're good facilitation, then you get the best out of people. You get a chance to pull out from people their information, their ideas, their knowledge. So the plan is not just to replicate the kind of hardware for Queen's Road, but also to get that skills base in there in terms of facilitation. And then finally, we've got the testing and trials thing. So we will be building further testing facilities up at Newborough, but again, I say ideally we have links into OGTC to try and utilise some of their partners as well. So I think at that point, I would just finish off and thank you for your attention. And I think it's now on to questions and discussion. Okay.
Okay, let's move on to question and answer. I'm hoping this is. Need someone competent to help me.
Yeah, it's just
I can, yeah.
So we're here. Sorry, yes.
Well, you mentioned before that in the case of having a lease, you are getting a profit out of that lease, obviously, but I guess there is a landlord who is getting a profit as well, so are they sharing the liability?
No, that's very much my point, that in fact, what's interesting about the idea of a lease as distinct from a license in this setting is that it looks as if we do have a landlord, as it were, who is deriving a profit. So I'm very much focusing on the fact that there is this other party deriving a financial benefit. So that's very much the angle that I'm taking.
Sharing the liability? Is that?
Well, I'm even going further than that, because what I'm suggesting is, or I'm raising the question, insofar as someone is acting as if they have these strong property rights, sufficient that they're issuing a lease as distinct from a license, I'm actually raising the question, does that mean that in essence they're claiming something akin to ownership, if not ownership itself? And even if we have some conceptual doubts about whether that concept exists on the continental shelf, if we have that idea of benefit in one part of the continental shelf, which looks to all intents and purposes at least analogous to ownership, what's the basis on which we then draw a distinction between the benefit here and the liability elsewhere? That's what I'm trying to work out. And of course, it all is extremely complicated, because at no point on the continental shelf have we sat down with a blank bit of paper and worked the whole thing out coherently. The whole, or the various normative orders, if you like, that operate there have evolved organically through time. And at various points, whether we're talking about the initial licensing regime, all the way through to the current strategy, we've never really, to my mind, looked at these things in the round in terms of, are we absolutely clear how the licensing fits with the statutory regime, with the strategy? How do these all fit together? Which one is the trump card if we end up in some kind of conflict? So these are the kinds of issues that I think it's intriguing to get underneath. Not least because I think as we move into the late stage of the province, you raise the probability that you have situations where the parties are not well aligned. In the early stages, it's all very exciting and we're all heading in the same direction. Think back to the 60s and 70s, a huge drive for a whole variety of reasons to move quickly, to get to first oil, to generate profits, to pay taxes. There's a good level of alignment. But we can get to a point in the late stage where again, we already know some of the drivers that can pull us apart, and we maybe have the beginning of insight into drivers down the road that might pull us apart. At that point, just because someone says it's on you doesn't mean that's going to stick. You're actually going to say, well, is that really the case? Show me if that's really the case. Can you explain these apparent incoherences in the systems?
And good morning, and thank you for a very interesting presentation. You highlighted that in Norway there was the opportunity for the state to take liability on the basis of a financial consideration. Has that actually happened? Is there any precedence for that?
To the best of my knowledge, no. So it's a very good question. I haven't had a chance to check recently, but the last time I did with a colleague who well informed in Norway, what they said was, really look at the wording. It's an option, but at that point, and I'm probably talking about a couple of years ago, it hadn't been taken up. So it's one thing that we need to to follow up. But it's the fact that it's there doesn't mean that everyone's been rushing to do it. Yeah. And again, I think that's going to be interesting to dig into. Has anyone asked, and has the state actually turned them down? What actually is going on?
John, thank you very much. A great presentation as normal. I was just interested in your discussion about duty of care and negligence of those who leave residual structure. The duty of care point I think is fairly clear, but my thoughts on the negligence would be that any operator who has left any residue is carrying out treaty obligations, is carrying out obligations in the Petroleum Act, is required ultimately to do that by government, and I would suggest there's an argument there to negate any possibility of negligence.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, and I think the point very much is that there are good reasons to suggest that provided an operator, a duty holder, is doing everything by the book, that in many respects it'll be very easy to, or relatively straightforward, to demonstrate that one has discharged that duty, was not negligent. I think it's worth saying also that if we did get to a point where, heaven forbid, there were to be some kind of collision, some loss, we'd also, in the context of litigation, have to think about contributory negligence. Because there could even be scenarios where, if we look at what Shell is proposing for some of the gravity-based platforms leaving legs up above the surface, in those circumstances, under the current law, the safety zone, the 500-metre exclusion zone, will continue. So again, you'd have to look at the exact circumstances in any case where a loss occurred. It's one thing to look at, has the duty of care been discharged by the duty holder? The other side of it, has there been any contributory negligence by someone who has got themselves into contact with infrastructure? Yeah.
I was wondering, each time there's a leasing or licensing round, the Press and Journal gets quite excited, and it's a record number of awards. And there's always a lot of excitement when there are a lot of small independents, taking on assets that super majors have had the benefit of for the last number of decades. So, if I was in the shoes of those small independents, I would be concerned from a contractual, commercial perspective about the potential that you've kind of explained today for that long-term liability. So my assumption is that there's no evidence that that's a deterrent to entry to the market in such a mature basin. And I suppose, really rather than a question, it's an observation that we don't see the detail of the commercial contractual agreements between Super Major 1 and Independent 2. So any thoughts on that?
No, I think it's a really good point. And on the one hand, it may simply be people have looked at this and thought, well, looking at all the different circumstances, is there anything really for me to worry about? We may have a low probability of a high consequence event, but probably it's something that we can live with. So that may be one way of looking at it. Another may be that perhaps that can is just being kicked down the road, that perhaps we're not necessarily thinking about it intensely, thinking, well, we'll get round to that in due course. Equally, as you say, there may be other things going on. So we know that under the guidance, the option is there for the regulator to keep a larger party with deeper pockets on the licence if they're not satisfied that those coming in have all the relevant resources to fulfil decommissioning obligations. We've also got the possibility of decommissioning security arrangements, but of course the idea would be that they would be for decommissioning and not for the long term. So I think it's again one of the factors that bears closer scrutiny. We need to see what is going on. Are we worrying unduly? Does the fact that, as you rightly say, it doesn't seem to be a deterrent indicate that even if everywhere we go we tend to hear people talking about this, perhaps it's something we can reasonably say shouldn't keep us awake at night. But this is where I think further study would be useful.
John, isn't it inevitable that the state will take responsibility in a scenario, perhaps 50 years' time, a well plug is breached, a loss of containment, the small opco is no longer there, something has to be done. It's going to fall to the state.
Well, again, I think, as well as using the word policy on the slide, we could have used the word pragmatism. that pragmatically we could well be in situations where the buck will have to stop with the state, because in the end the obligations under international law rest with the state. It of course then will, in various circumstances, pass those down the chain, but the buck stops with the state in terms of international law. So I think you're right. So pragmatically also, when we look at it in those terms, we might be thinking in terms not only of the state saying, well, we'd like the industry collectively to think about what kind of arrangement might work here, some sort of mutual instrument, but we might also say, if we take that pragmatic approach to the conclusion that you're doing, quite rightly, is it really a question for the industry long term? Is it not one for the state, or is there some more collective arrangement that we could make, perhaps analogous to Norway? That's a good point.
Hi. My understanding is that liability isn't perpetual in general, in law generally, and therefore would it be fair and reasonable to have liability in perpetuity?
Well, I think this is a very, very good point, isn't it? Because we've got that statement in the guidance which says that the liability will remain with the owner in perpetuity. Does that make sense? And I think there are a variety of ways of looking at this which make it look as if this is an impractical situation. And I think we can see that from another perspective. If we look again at the Carbon Capture and Storage Directive, the only way that CCS is going to work, leaving aside the technical issues, but from a practical financial point of view, is if private sector actors at a certain point are able to transfer the long-term liability. So I think for a whole variety of reasons, there are arguments that would very much back up what you're saying. Yeah.
Sorry to interject again, John. I was just thinking of that interesting question about perpetual liability. I suppose the law of nuisance applies to any land any of us may own. Mm-hmm. We are, in fact, and our successors are forever liable for nuisance from our land. Yeah. So I suppose in that sense there is some kind of parallel. Yeah, I think that's probably quite a good way of doing it. And I suppose the point you make there, though, of successors, there is an assumption that in the long term, certainly over the potentially hundreds of years we're talking about here, it would be extraordinary, really, if all the relevant duty holders were still in any way recognisable form, even 100 years from now. Okay, Aberdeen University's been here for 520, so I suppose there are some good role models there, but you know what I mean.
Well, my question now is about restricted area. So close to a platform, I heard that there is like a restricted area where people can't really go in. Once the top side of the platform has been decommissioned, does it remain that area as a banned area or restricted area? So
my understanding is that where anything is still protruding above the surface, then the safety zone will remain in place. But if it's been, if it's cut to levels consistent with UNCLOS, OSPAR, etc., then it could still be navigated over, but of course it would be marked on hydrographic charts. So the key distinction is anything protruding above the surface or not? That will determine whether a safety zone remains in place.
Hi John, thanks. Great presentation. We had a bit of discussion there about where liability rests, so kind of picking up on the pragmatism and the case of an abandoned well. Whoever has the liability, are we set up technically, so who retains the knowledge in the subsurface of a leak that's happening at 4,000 feet in 70 years' time? Just so, not who's got the baby, but do we have the knowledge?
Yeah, so I think many people in the room will have a better idea than me, but my sense is perhaps that we don't have anything in the form of some sort of absolutely clear, definitive register, if you like. I think some of the wording in the most recent version of the guidance kind of indicates that's the direction that BEIS is thinking about. The idea of continuing contact, keeping a track of who would have ongoing responsibility for not only monitoring, but it looks as if that also applies to the question of continuing liability. So I think that's maybe one of the developments that's in prospect, but I don't have anything more than that. Yeah.
Just a quick question to give Professor Paterson a break from the questions. It was great to hear about the National Decommissioning Centre. Really exciting. Great that that's coming to Aberdeen. And when you're open for business, what's your timescales?
I mean, I guess in terms of projects, we're probably open for business just now. In terms of the official opening, it'll be early 2019. But I mean, we're already running projects. So I mean, I'm already involved with a project with a service company and the OGTC. I say we have other projects running as well. These PhD studentships will be up and running. We'll be advertising them within the next couple of weeks, and they'll be running early in the new year as well. But I mean, if you know people who want projects done, then come speak to myself or Rodgerson or Russell Stevenson. So yeah, we're kind of, the building is there. We have some people there, so we've got capacity to do things.
I think this might be our last question.
Sorry, back to John again. Are there any parallels from the shipping industry in terms of long-term liability?
Yeah. Well, you know, it's a very good point. I'm not exactly sure whether there's anything relevant. I did have a word with one or two folks on the oil industry side and kind of raised the question of whether we could draw analogies from things like MARPOL and so on. And my sense was I was being pushed away from that. Nothing to see here. Now, my sense is that perhaps then that means there probably isn't. But no, it looks as if something like that, some sort of mutual arrangement, maybe equivalent to MARPOL, might be what BEIS has in mind when it's talking about encouraging the industry to think in terms of some sort of mutual arrangement or instrument. And I think it will be an area for future research to look at other options, whether from shipping or indeed other industries as well, that might give us a useful analogy. So I think it's a very good point for further investigation. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much to Professor Paterson and Professor Neilson. And please do stay for some coffee. There's more food and have a further chat if you'd like.
Thank you, Gráinne, and thank you very much for coming along this morning. I just thought I'd add another level of complexity, one that I hadn't mentioned so far. You can see that when I was hinting there at liability potentially lying with that party that has issued leases and therefore seems to be exercising strong property rights, and we're pointing to the Crown Estate. But the more astute among you and the more observant will be thinking, yeah, but it's not the Crown Estate now north of the border, is it? Because assets and liabilities in the Crown Estate under the Scotland Act have been transferred to Scottish ministers. So we've got another nice little layer of complexity. Plenty of work for lawyers, which is always good news. So thank you very much.